Hi, I'm Musto, and yeah, I'm back. In the previous part of the ice cream waffle video, I talked about how to set up the materials, and this time, let's talk about the rendering side of things. For example, using the compositor and do a little bit of compositing, and also adding some freestyle lines and a little bit of camera shake for the final animation. With that said, let's continue with the ice cream waffle video. And before we start, please note that some of the nodes that I'm using in this video has been replaced in the newer versions of Blender. For example, the Mix RGB node has been replaced by the Mix Color node. And now the separate HSV node is part of the separate color node. So use the corresponding nodes in the newer version of Blender and everything will work just fine. An interesting thing that we can do is to actually add some PBR materials onto our NPR scene, and perhaps modify those PBR materials to look a little bit more NPR. And this is also something that I showed in the previous videos for the bacon one and also the water bottle one. So right now I'm going to add a PBR wood texture onto our table. So now since we have to add texture onto our table, we have to first unwrap it. So now let's go into UV editing and just start adding those seams that you need for your UVs so as to use those textures. So I'm going to mark the seams for the 4 edges at the bottom and also the 4 edges for the corners right here. Since this object has been scaled, perhaps we should also use Ctrl A and just apply the scale for now. So now that we have these edges selected, we can hit Ctrl E and mark the seam. And then select everything by hitting A and just U unwrap. So now we have our UV map right here. So now maybe let me go online and actually find some material for our table. So I've added some wood texture onto the table and also I added an HDRI. There are a lot of free HDRI and also textures on websites like Ambient CG and also Polyhaven. So maybe you can check those websites out and just use some of those nice texture that they provide. So now this is our scene and it still doesn't look too anime. Maybe we can take a look at the camera view since I've set a camera pointing at our waffle right here. It still doesn't look too anime. What we can do is to go ahead and change the material of our table texture. So this is the table texture. It has a lot of PBR textures plugged into and principled BSDF, which you would normally do when you do PBR stuff. But what we can do is to add a converter shader to RGB after the principled BSDF and just start modifying the colors for a little bit. So now we can actually mess with how the shader looks because it is now some color data after the shader to RGB. So maybe we can add a separate HSV for now. And then we are going to get a combined HSV and put it after. So make sure you connect all the S and the V's like this. So now we have the original. But what we can do is to modify the values, which is the V input. So we can put a color ramp between the V's right here and just give it a little bit more anime cel shaded look. What we can do is to add a few more colors between the black and white. So let me hit the plus button, hit the plus button again, and then select the white and hit the plus button again like this. And then we can change this to constant. And let's see how it looks for now. So now it looks more like a stylized table instead of the original PBR table, which is kind of what we want. So maybe what we can do is to add a mix RGB after everything and just kind of add a little bit of color on top. So with this mix RGB, we can layer some colors on top of our PBR texture. So right now I'm layering some orange color on top of our table, which looks pretty much like what we want. And right here we can actually start adding some outlines onto our models. So let me go into the scene render properties just go down here and go to Freestyle and just enable it right here. So now that we have enabled Freestyle, we can start messing with the settings of the Freestyle. So Freestyle is a way to add outlines to your objects without using something like inverted hole, because there are some downsides of using inverted hole method. So let me show you how we can use the Freestyle to add outlines. So let me go to the view layer properties right here and scroll down to Freestyle. And what we can do is to go to Freestyle line set and start adding some modifiers onto different properties of the Freestyle. So let me go down here to Freestyle color, and what we can add is the modifier called material. So this way we can set the outline color for all individual materials, so they won't all be the same and using the black color by default. So we can also go down to Freestyle thickness and add a modifier called a long stroke. And what this does is to modify the thickness variation of your outlines. So we can add some interesting hand-drawn look to our outlines if we change this mapping to curve. And then I'm just going to make the curve something like this. Something like this. And this way we can get some hand-drawn outlines onto our models. So now perhaps we can go back to the materials of all objects and start messing with the Freestyle line color. So if we go to the right down here of each material, we can see this Freestyle line setting. So we can change this color to match our object. So let's say for this ice cream, I want a color that is kinda like a dark green color for the outline. There's a mosquito flying around my room, sorry. God, that's such a big mosquito. Ugh. So perhaps we can use a dark green color for our ice cream as the outline color. So now let's do this for the rest of the materials that we have. So now perhaps let me render ones by hitting F12. So this is the render that I got after the Freestyle line sets, and you can see there are some nice outlines along the edge and also the internal like edges around our object. So maybe I think this effect is still a little bit too subtle, so maybe I'm going to increase the thickness of the outline even more. And what I'm gonna do is to increase the max value in this long stroke modifier for our Freestyle thickness. So maybe I'm just going to increase this to maybe 2 and see how it looks. So I'm gonna render one more time right now. So now I changed the max value to 2 and it seems like it is a little bit more noticeable. And I think I want something in the middle. So what I'm gonna do is to just perhaps change the max value to something like 1.5 and see how it looks again. I think this is a little bit better for 1.5. It's kind of the value that I want. So maybe I'm going to move on to adjusting the scene for a little bit more right now. So now this is the camera angle that I have for my scene, and I think the shadows are a little bit too unnoticeable and makes everything feels a little bit flat. So maybe I want the light to rotate for a little bit just so I can get a little bit more shadow around my objects. So what I'm gonna do is to modify the world HDRI for a little bit. So now I'm in the world material editor, and we can see that there's an option for us to rotate our HDRI. In case you don't have this, you just have to click on your HDRI and Control T. And now you have this. And what I'm gonna do is to just rotate the HDRI along the Z-axis because I want to get a little bit more shadow on my object. And I feel like the plate material is acting a little bit weird. Probably it has something to do with the roughness of the plate. So maybe I'm just going to play around with the plate material for a little bit, just so I can get the actual shapes that I want back. And perhaps I'm going to change the colors of the plate a little bit more as well, because I think it's under some form of sunlight, or I want this to be in a sunset setting. So maybe I'm just going to change the white to a little bit yellowish of a color like this. And also the gray in the middle, maybe just make it a little bit more orange. Something like this. You know, it's really a matter of artistic choices. So I think I want this color to be a little bit darker like this. I'm just gonna make sure it's not so saturated, because after all, it should be white before under any lighting, because it's still white without any lighting. So maybe just a tiny bit, a little bit of orange in there, and perhaps this is how it's gonna look. But what I'm thinking is that the table looks a little bit too flat. I think I want a little bit more shadow on my table. So what I'm gonna do is to add one more layer of two-step shading onto my table. So like what I always do is to just hit Shift A, make sure I'm inside the table's material, and I'm just gonna hit Shift A and then add diffuse BSDF, and then I'm gonna preview this, and then I'm gonna use shader to RGB with the color ramp like this, like what I always do all the time. And maybe just increase the shadow, just bring down, just adjust the white color until I get the shadow that I want. And then I'm just going to multiply this on top of everything that comes before. My laptop is kind of getting noisy, so I'm sorry if you're hearing some noise and my voice is getting a little bit muffled, but I'm going to change the blending mode of this shadow that I add to multiply, of course. But of course you can experiment with different blending modes, and I'm just gonna strengthen the shadow for a little bit more, just like this. And I think I want the bottom waffle to actually have the sugar as well. So right now I'm just gonna go ahead and change. Maybe I'm just gonna give this a fake user and just change it to the sugar one, so it looks a little bit better. Since this is based on UV, I'm just going to apply the mirror modifier and just going to unwrap this from the side so I get the same effect as the top one, just like this. So now this is our scene, so maybe let me render one more and see how it looks. So now this is the render that I got. I still think there isn't enough shadow under the waffles, so maybe I'm going to add a little bit of ambient occlusion onto the plate. So what I'm gonna do is to add an input ambient occlusion onto the plate material, and I'm just gonna mix this on top of everything. So Control Shift right click and drag it onto this color ramp that we have, and just change this to multiply as well. Now I'm just gonna perhaps go ahead and use a converter and math. And what I'm gonna do is to change this to power. And the thing about this power node is you can just increase the exponent to just make everything a little bit stronger, just like this. So I can get a little bit more shadow on top. And then the thing is, I'm going to change the color of the ambient occlusion. So I'm going to put a color ramp after the power, so I can change the color of the ambient occlusion, so it's not like really black, because I don't want it to be really black like that. That's not what I want. So maybe a color that's somewhat dark, and also maybe decrease the exponent for a little bit. Just decrease it a little bit back to 3. I'm just gonna maybe change this to constant and see how I can modify this. You can see that there are still a lot of noises in the ambient occlusion, despite the fact that I changed the color ramp to constant. And this happens a lot using the ambient occlusion node, so maybe I'm just going to keep this as linear and maybe just bring everything together. and just get a little bit more shadow under our little waffle. Maybe something like this. So now this is how the scene looks, and maybe I'm just gonna render one more and see how this looks. So now this is how it looks, and I think it's pretty nice. Still, I think it's a little bit too flat around some areas. For example, under the ice cream, I think there isn't quite enough shadow. So maybe I'm just going to modify the waffle material even more. It's really about bouncing back and forth between a lot of areas and aspects in your art, and just to check how we can make it a little bit better. So maybe I'm just going to increase the power of the ambient occlusion. Maybe it's too strong this way. Maybe I'm going to add a color ramp after the power of our ambient occlusion in the waffle. So maybe I'm just going to bring in the black a little bit more, the white over as well. So something like this. I just want a little bit more shadow under the ice cream so it actually looks like it's on top. Maybe I want a little bit more sugar and just make them a little bit smaller. So maybe I'm just going to increase the scale for the sugar for a little bit more. And I think the shadow around this side is a little bit too intense, so I'm just going to decrease the multiply on my waffle a little bit. And I think... so make sure you tweak everything until you get something that kind of looks like what you want. Maybe I'm just going to make this a little bit more yellowish, just to get that nice waffle color. Maybe I'm going to render it one more time and see how it looks. So now this is how it looks, and I think it looks alright. Perhaps I want maybe a piece of chocolate right here, so maybe let me model a piece of chocolate real quick.
Making a piece of chocolate is simple. Add a little cube and start insetting and extruding faces. Then add 2 different array modifiers onto 2 different axes to create the whole piece of chocolate. Then start beveling some of the edges to prevent the edges from being too sharp.
And maybe I'm just going to add a very simple 2-step shader onto the chocolate. So add a new material and call this chocolate like this. Why did I hit caps lock? Why did I hit caps lock? I'm stupid. Bakayaru. And then, okay, let me get in here. I'm just gonna change the principle to diffuse by Shift S after you're selecting the principle. So this way we can just swap away. And I'm using a diffuse just because it's smaller and it's easier to see, I guess. So I'm gonna increase this. And then converter, color ramp. Before that, I need a shader to RGB. So before that, shader to RGB, and then into color ramp. And then I'm just gonna go to constant and just make a nice chocolate. Maybe I'm gonna use 3 steps so we can get those beveled edges a little bit better. I think the shading is a little bit weird along some of the edges of our chocolate, so I'm just gonna add a few more loop cuts. And then I'm just gonna change the colors to chocolate color. So, I mean, you guys all had chocolate before. If you haven't, I don't know what you're doing, but no, I'm just kidding. But I'm just gonna add some nice chocolate colors onto our chocolate. Okay, so now this is how the chocolate looks. Maybe I'm just going to copy this dark color, Control C on top of the field, and then just paste it into the freestyle outline and make it a little bit darker, just like this. Actually a lot darker, but let's see how it looks right now. I think the outlines are a little bit too thick right now, so now that I think of it, maybe I'm gonna change it back to 1 and render one more time and see how it looks. Now this is how it looks, and I think it looks not so bad. Maybe I'm going to change the line color of the chocolate. So yeah, I'm going back again and just kind of gonna increase the color to be a little bit brighter. So now I think this is pretty good. It's pretty anime if you ask me. Something is missing. I think it has something to do with compositing. And also I might add a little bit of camera shake when I render the animation, but for now, maybe let's play around with the compositing. And then maybe I'm going to add some camera shake behind the scenes. Let me go ahead and enable use nodes inside the compositor and make sure I'm just at the right place. Okay. Alright, so let me go ahead and Control Shift, left click onto the render layers, and just hit V just to make sure the preview is a little bit smaller so we can see it. So what I'm gonna do is to add a little bit of glow on top of our render. So what I'm gonna do is to add use something called ellipse mask under matte, Shift A, matte, ellipse mask, and this is what we have. A nice ellipse mask. And I'm just going to increase like the width and the height just so it's really big like this. And then I'm going to blur the edges using the filter, and then probably just blur. I think it's enough. And just increase the X and Y to maybe 200, is it? I want it to be really soft around the edge, so maybe 300 is the blur amount that we want. And right now I'm just going to position this somewhere around here of our render. So what I'm gonna do is to add this mask onto our rendered image. So what I'm gonna do now is to Control Shift right click and just drag this onto our render layers, just like how we mix stuff in the material editor. And I'm just gonna change this to add, and now you can see this really strong glow right in the middle of our render. So I'm just gonna modify the X and Y just little by little and make sure it's just around this corner. So maybe I'm just gonna preview this. Maybe I'm just gonna take a look at the mask itself so it's less laggy, because the blur is really laggy for some reason. So I'm just gonna position the mask around the top right corner, and then let's take a look at the ad and maybe just decrease the strength of the ad for a little bit, just like this. And maybe just change this mask to be some other color that's not white. So what I'm gonna do is to just add a color. Maybe just use a color and change the white to something yellowish or orange-ish like this. So now just decrease everything for a little bit. Just make sure it's very subtle. Just make sure this glow that we have is very subtle. Let's take a look at the rendering tab and just perhaps render one more time and see how it looks. And I actually forgot to connect this into the composite node. This is what you actually get in your render. So now I think this looks pretty nice. And what we can do is to just start animating our scene, maybe add a little bit of camera shake, and we are pretty much done actually. So let me go ahead and add a little bit of camera shake, and let's take a look at the final render together. I guess I might as well show you how I make the camera shake. So it's actually very simple. So make sure you select your camera after you have your desired camera angle. Just hit I and just say add a keyframe in location and rotation. Now that you see there's a keyframe right here, let me go ahead and open up the graph editor right here. So what we are gonna do is to add some noise. So probably I'm just going to add some noise on the Z location first. So let's go to the Z location, make sure it's selected, and then go to the side right here and just look for modifiers and say noise. Now you can see it shakes like really hard, and it's definitely not what we want. So make sure you increase the scale until it's has a less frequent shake. And also we can decrease the strength just to make sure it doesn't shake way too much. So it's kind of like a very steady shake. Something like this. If you take a look at the left side, this is kind of what we want. Maybe just a little bit more for the strength, and maybe just decrease the scale a little bit just so it moves a bit more. And now let us add the same thing onto the X location. So now noise, increase the scale, and just decrease the strength, and we can tweak from here. But I think this is pretty good actually. Maybe not so much, just like this. And maybe add a little bit of rotation noise along perhaps the X-axis rotation. So let's go to the X rotation and add some noise as well. Now if we play, it's crazy, so let me go ahead and take a look at the X location, I mean the rotation, and hit the dot just to see it a little bit clearly. I'm just gonna decrease the strength for a lot. And you see it's still really strong for rotation. So this value has to be really small. Let's say 0.05. It's still a little bit too strong. So 0.01. So I think this is fine. Let's play around with scale for a little bit more. So it's not so much. So it's just a little bit. And maybe also, let me go back to the Z location and just maybe decrease the strength for a little bit more. And also the X location, I want it to be very subtle, a very subtle camera shake. So this movement is what we have right now. And I think it's fine. It's subtle enough and it sells the handheld motion. You can add a lot more noises onto other locations and rotation fields, but I think I'm just gonna add it onto XZ location and also X rotation. So now maybe I'm just going to render an animation out, and let's take a look if there's anything that we can actually change. So I've actually tried adding a little bit of lens distortion, also known as chromatic aberration, onto the image. Is kind of fancy, but I think it's a little bit too strong. It's inside the compositing mode, and just go ahead and search for distort and lens distortion, and that's what you want. And what we are gonna change is the value called dispersion. So it was 0.1, so maybe 0.05. Let's see if it affects too much. I think 0.07, maybe it's the right number that I want. Oh no, not 0.7. Oh my god. Oh my god. Oh my god. Oh my god. Okay, so this is what we actually want. So let me render one more time to see how this lens distortion works before I actually render out an animation. Okay, so this is what we have right now, just a tiny bit of lens distortion, chromatic aberration, whatever you call it. But I think this is pretty nice for what we want to achieve today. Just some basic anime style food, and also how to add freestyle onto your render, and perhaps just a little bit of compositing tricks, camera shakes, something like that. It's a very basic project, but I hope you did learn something from this project. So maybe let me render this out as an animation, then we can take a look at the final result together.
The scene looks pretty complete, but I decided to add a little bit of details onto the ice cream, so it looks like it's melting. What I'm using here are metaballs, which are pretty useful because they just naturally stick together, so you can form some pretty interesting shapes at the base of the ice cream. And after all these details, this is the final scene. And that's it for this 3-part ice cream waffle video. Hope you guys learned something useful from this mini-series, and make sure to use these techniques onto different stylized art that you are making. Hope you guys had a great Christmas, and
Happy New Year!